The morning fog clung to the English countryside like a thick gray blanket as the first engines began to rumble awake. It was early 1943 at RAF Bassingbourn, and in the pale half-light before dawn, the shapes of B-17 Flying Fortresses emerged one by one from the haze. Crewmen moved around them like shadows, loading ammunition belts, checking hydraulic lines, tightening bolts with numb fingers. The cold bit through gloves and jackets, but no one complained. They were preparing the machines that would carry them deep into enemy territory, into the heart of Germany itself. Lieutenant Robert Hayes stood beneath the wing of his B-17, wiping frost from the metal. He had flown only a handful of missions, yet he already understood why the older crews spoke about the fortress the way sailors spoke about ships that had carried them safely across stormy seas. The B-17 was not just a bomber, it was a companion, a guardian, a brute made of steel and stubbornness. The ground shook as the first engine started. A deep roar rolled across the airfield, vibrating through Hayes' boots. Then another engine, then another. Soon the entire base was thundering. The Flying Fortress lived up to its name before it even left the ground. Hayes climbed the ladder into the cockpit. Frost covered the instruments. He breathed on the glass, wiped it clean, and settled into his seat. The bomber smelled of oil, metal, and canvas. Cold air blew through gaps in the fuselage. He looked back at his crew as they strapped into their stations. The tail gunner, the radio operator, the waist gunners, the bombardier, the engineer standing between the pilots, hands ready on the controls. Each man depended on the others. Each man trusted the aircraft more than he trusted fate. Outside, dawn finally broke, casting long golden streaks across the rows of B-17s. The runway shimmered like a path leading straight into the unknown. When people talked about the Flying Fortress, they talked about its guns. 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns bristled from its nose, chin, cheeks, belly, tail, and waist. A sphere of firepower so dense that enemy fighters often hesitated before attacking. But anyone who flew the fortress knew its true power was not in how it fought. It was in how it survived. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines hung beneath its wings like iron fists, each one powerful enough to keep the aircraft in the air even if the others failed. The fuselage was built from interlocking frames of strengthened alloy. The control cables were duplicated, so that if one set was cut by flak, the other could still guide the aircraft home. The wings were thick, the skin durable. The bones of the machine were not elegant, but relentless. It was built to take punishment. And on this morning, punishment was waiting. The order crackled through the intercom. "Start your taxi." The engines roared louder. The runway trembled as the B-17 rolled forward. One after another, the Flying Fortresses lined up, dozens of silver giants stretching toward the horizon. Their propellers spun in perfect rhythm, creating a shimmering wall of motion. Hayes' heart pounded. Every mission felt like stepping into a storm you could not see, only imagine. But as the fortress gained speed, lifting from the earth with slow, powerful determination, some of the fear melted away. The aircraft climbed steadily, rising through the last layers of mist, breaking into the clear blue sky above. He felt the weight of the world fall behind them. Below, the countryside shrank into patches of green and brown. Above, the sun climbed higher, painting the wings in bright white. More fortresses joined formation from other bases, until an entire armada filled the morning air, their engines merging into a single, steady heartbeat. They looked unstoppable. But every man in the formation knew the truth. Soon they would cross the North Sea, then the Dutch coast, then the long stretch toward the Ruhr. And from that moment on, the sky would become a killing ground. The German fighters would come, the flak would rise like black flowers blooming in the air. Metal would tear, engines would fail, wings would break. And yet mission after mission, the B-17s kept coming home. Hayes remembered stories he had heard around the mess hall. A fortress landed with 2 engines dead and a third one coughing smoke. Another returned with a hole the size of a door carved through its right wing. One limped back with its landing gear locked and its tail gunner unconscious. He had assumed they were exaggerations, but the veterans simply smiled and shook their heads. The B-17 was different. It was stubborn. It was alive in ways no one could fully explain. As the formation crossed the coast, cold wind blasted through the gaps in the fuselage. Hayes tightened his oxygen mask. The radio operator spoke quietly into his mic. The waist gunners checked their ammunition belts. Frost crept across the windows. Ahead, the sky began to darken, not with clouds, but with flak already blooming in the far distance. Black bursts appeared like ink spots in the sky. Someone whispered over the intercom, "Here we go." Hayes steadied the Fortress, keeping it in formation even as turbulence shook the wings. More flak bursts erupted ahead, closer now, louder, shaking the cockpit with thumps that echoed through the metal ribs of the aircraft. The flight engineer glanced at the gauges, then at Hayes. "She can take it." Hayes nodded. He believed it. But he had yet to see the truth with his own eyes. What a B-17 could endure. How much destruction it could survive. How many holes it could carry home. He was about to learn. Because this mission, this day, would be the first time he witnessed the Flying Fortress do something no ordinary aircraft should be capable of doing. It would be hit. It would be torn. It would bleed metal and fire. And it would keep flying anyway. The legend was about to prove itself. The first burst of flak hit the formation like a thunderclap. A B-17 in the upper left quadrant jerked violently as a cloud of black smoke blossomed beneath it, sending metal fragments slicing upward. Hayes felt the shock, even from his position, though the explosion was several hundred yards away. The intercom crackled with the voice of the navigator. "Flak heavy at 2 o'clock. Stay tight." Hayes tightened his grip on the control yoke, fighting the turbulence created by the overlapping propeller wash of the formation. The Fortress shuddered, flexing its wings like a living creature. More black bursts filled the sky. The Germans were waiting, their guns calibrated, their timing perfect. The flak did not whisper. It roared. A shell exploded near the nose of a B-17 ahead of Hayes. Shrapnel tore through the plexiglass, showering the bombardier with glittering shards. Yet the aircraft held course. The bombardier pushed the debris aside with a bloodied glove and continued scanning the ground below. Another explosion struck the left wing of Hayes' aircraft. The shockwave rattled the cockpit. Alarm lights flickered. The engineer leaned forward, checking gauges, tapping them with a practiced knuckle. "Left outboard engine running rough, but still running." Hayes exhaled sharply. The Fortress had taken the hit, absorbed it, and kept pushing forward with stubborn determination. That was the design. The Boeing engineers had not built a bomber that avoided damage. They had built one that expected it. Steel ribs ran through the fuselage like the bones of an iron giant. Redundant cables and backup hydraulic lines lay hidden behind layers of plating. And the engines, those massive cyclone beasts, could haul the bomber even if one or two were dead. The Germans knew this, and it frustrated them more than anything. As the formation crossed deeper into German airspace, fighters appeared, first as specks, then as streaks, then as screaming shapes cutting across the sky. Bf-109s, FW-190s, pilots with hundreds of missions behind them. They dove straight into the formation, guns blazing, cannon shells flashing like white sparks. Hayes heard the waist gunners open fire. The entire aircraft shook with the rhythm of the half-caliber guns. Shell casings poured out of the side doors, raining into the sky like brass waterfalls. The top turret swiveled, tracking an approaching fighter. The engineer fired a long burst, his tracers arcing toward the enemy. A 109 streaked by, smoke trailing from its wing. Another dove toward Hayes' aircraft. Bullets hammered the fuselage. The cockpit vibrated with the impact. Hayes felt the floor tremble beneath his boots. The right waist gunner shouted, "We're hit, right side, big holes." But the Fortress did not flinch. It kept its altitude. It kept its heading. It kept its place in formation. A scream in the intercom cut across the gunfire. "Engine 2 is burning!" Hayes looked out the window and saw it, a long trail of flame licking across the nacelle. He braced for the shudder of a dead engine. Instead, the flames sputtered, coughed, then died. The engineer shouted again.
Automatic fire suppression worked, engine at reduced power. Hayes wanted to laugh. Not in joy, but in disbelief. This plane refuses to die. Ahead of them, another B-17 took a direct hit. The explosion threw a burst of metal across the formation. Its left wingtip tore away, spinning into the clouds below. Flames licked across the wounded wing. The bomber fell into a slow, sickening roll. Hayes felt a knot form in his throat. But then, impossibly, the bomber leveled out. The pilot had regained control. The aircraft was missing a chunk of its wing. Smoke poured from the engine. The tail gunner was yelling something no one could understand. But it kept flying. It stayed in formation. A B-17 could lose pieces no other aircraft could survive and still claw its way home. Hayes saw more proof moments later. A fortress ahead of him had its nose smashed open by cannon fire. The bombardier crawled backward, covered in blood and glass. The wind howled through the hole where the plexiglass had been. The aircraft shuddered violently, but stayed steady enough for the navigator to crawl into the bomb bay and manually release the payload. He pulled the lever. The bombs fell. Mission accomplished. The right waist gunner suddenly shouted into the intercom again. "We lost the control cables. A piece of flak cut them." The engineer did not hesitate. "Switching to backup lines." He reached under the panel, flipped a series of switches, and the fortress shuddered once more. The backup cables took control. Hayes felt the yoke respond, not perfectly, not smoothly, but enough. Enough to fly. Another burst of flak hit the belly of the bomber. The ball turret gunner screamed as the shell burst beneath him. The turret shook, jammed, then stopped completely. I could hear the panic in the gunner's voice. "I am stuck, cannot rotate." Hayes answered with as much calm as he could summon. "Hold on. We will get you home." That was what the fortress did. It got men home. Pieces torn off, metal bent, controls half working, engines coughing oil, wings full of holes, cabin full of smoke, but still flying, still pushing, still refusing to die. The German fighters made one last attempt as the formation turned back toward the North Sea. A group of FW-190s dove from above, firing at the wounded aircraft lagging behind. Hayes saw one B-17 take so many hits that its tail looked like a torn flag. The vertical stabilizer shook with every gust of wind. But the pilot kept it steady. Hayes had never seen anything like it. The fortress looked like it should fall apart at any moment, yet it stayed in the air as if held together by sheer will. By the time they reached the coastline, the sky was quiet again. Hayes looked over his shoulder and saw the damage to his own bomber. The skin was ripped open in half a dozen places. The wings were dented, one engine smoked softly, bullet holes peppered the fuselage like metal freckles. And yet the aircraft flew smoothly as they crossed the sea, heading west, heading home, heading towards the safety of England. Hayes' voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Now I understand." The legend of the Flying Fortress was not a story. It was real. And he had only seen the beginning, because the most unbelievable survival story of all was still waiting for him. The story of a B-17 that lost half its body and still refused to fall. The story was whispered on airfields long before Hayes ever heard it. Mechanics repeated it while tightening bolts. Pilots retold it over weak coffee in freezing tents. Ground crews swore it was true because they had seen the photographs with their own eyes. A B-17 that lost half its tail. A bomber ripped open from the waist back. A machine that should have fallen apart in seconds, but instead stayed in the sky for more than an hour. Its name was the All-American, and its survival became the most legendary story to ever rise from the European Air War. Hayes first heard the tale on the evening of his 10th mission. The crew was exhausted, uniforms stained with oil and sweat. A young waist gunner from another squadron sat with them, his hand still shaking. "You think your fortress took damage today?" He shook his head. "You have not heard what happened to the All-American." Hayes leaned forward, listening as the gunner began the story. It had happened months earlier, in February 1943, during a mission over Tunisia. The All-American, part of the 414th Bomb Squadron, had completed its bombing run and was turning home when a group of Bf-109s pounced from above. The German fighters swarmed the formation, firing cannon shells that burst against wings and fuselages. The All-American fought back, its guns spitting fire in every direction. A Bf-109 made a head-on pass, guns blazing. The fortress answered, tearing the German fighter apart. But debris from the exploding 109 did not fall away. It kept coming. At nearly 400 miles per hour, the remains of the German aircraft slammed into the tail of the All-American. The result was catastrophic. The tail section of the B-17 split open. A massive chunk of the rear fuselage was torn away. The tail gunner compartment was nearly severed. The left tailplane hung at a broken angle. The vertical stabilizer was cracked, barely attached to the rest of the aircraft. Wind howled through the new wound, ripping fabric, bending metal, threatening to tear the fortress in half. Every man on board felt the impact. The aircraft lurched as if struck by a hammer the size of a house. The pilots fought for control, hands shaking as they pulled the yoke, trying to level the bomber before it rolled over and plunged into the desert far below. First Lieutenant Kendrick, the pilot, saw the damage in the side mirror mounted near the cockpit. His breath caught in his throat. The airplane was almost cut in two. His co-pilot shouted, "We are losing the tail. We need to bail out." But Kendrick shook his head. Not yet. The All-American was not falling. Not yet. And as long as it flew, Kendrick would not abandon it. The crew scrambled to assess the damage. The waist gunners tried to move toward the tail, but the moment they stepped near the torn section, cold wind nearly blew them out of the plane. The tail gunner, miraculously alive, was pinned against the twisted frame, gripping anything he could find as the air screamed past him. One misstep, one stumble, and he would be thrown into open sky. The intercom crackled with static and frantic voices. "We need to secure the tail. It is going to break off." The crew sprang into action. In a desperate improvisation that would later become part of the bomber's legend, they used parachute cords, flak vests, emergency radios, even their own jackets to tie the remains of the tail section to the fuselage. They worked on their knees, crawling toward the torn edge while the aircraft bucked and shook. Kendrick shouted from the cockpit, "Hold it together back there. We are keeping her level." But the fortress fought them every moment. With half its tail gone, the All-American tried to twist sideways. The controls felt sluggish. The right rudder barely responded. Every gust of wind threatened to wrench the tail completely off. The pilots compensated with brutal control inputs, their arms straining as they fought against physics itself. The bombardier used his body weight to brace loose equipment so it would not slide out the gaping hole in the fuselage. The radio operator jammed his foot against a loose panel to keep it from tearing free and hitting the tail gunner. Every man on board was now fighting the airplane itself, trying to keep it alive. Then someone shouted the words they've all feared. Enemy fighters. Coming back. Two Bf-109s reappeared on the horizon. The All-American was crippled, flying slower, struggling to stay in formation. It was an easy kill. But the formation ahead of them turned as one. Dozens of B-17s shifted position, tightening their circle, creating a wall of steel around the wounded aircraft. They fired at the approaching Germans with such fury that the 109s broke off and dove away, unwilling to face the overlapping fire of a dozen angry gun crews. The All-American continued to limp home, minute by minute, mile by mile. Every vibration felt like the last. The crew spoke little. No one needed to say what they feared. At any moment, the tail might snap free, sending the bomber tumbling into the empty desert. The radio operator managed to send a brief message to base, returning damaged, severely. When the North African coastline came into view, several crewmen began to cry. Not from fear, from relief. The impossible was becoming real. The All-American was still flying. When Kendrick lowered the landing gear, everyone held their breath. The aircraft bucked, twisted, and groaned. Metal scraped. The runway rushed toward them. The Fortress hit the ground hard, but it stayed intact. The aircraft rolled to a stop, its torn tail sagging, its fuselage bent like a broken spine. Ground crews ran to the bomber, expecting to find wounded men, expecting to pull bodies from the wreckage. Instead, they found an entire crew standing on the runway, shaken, but alive. Behind them, the All-American stood like a ghost, half its tail missing, ribs exposed, metal peeled back like a cracked hull of a ship. Someone on the ground whispered the words that would follow the aircraft forever. How did that thing stay in the air? The answer was simple. It was a flying fortress. It was built not just to fly, but to survive. And on that day, the All-American proved what every American crewman would soon come to believe. The Fortress was the plane that refused to die.
Stories of the All-Americans spread across every airfield where B-17 crews lived, fought, and waited for dawn. But it was not the only fortress to carve its name into legend. Across England, North Africa, and Italy, dozens of battered B-17s returned home in states that defied physics, logic, and every expectation of survival. Each story added another layer to the growing myth of the Flying Fortress, a machine that could be burning, broken, shredded, bleeding oil and metal, yet still claw its way back through cloud, wind, and fire. Lieutenant Hayes learned these stories one by one, often in moments when the day seemed quiet, when the crews gathered around small metal stoves or sat along the wing of a grounded bomber. The stories were told in low voices, not to impress, but because no one had ever forgotten them. One of the first he heard was about a fortress called Ye Old Pub. It had taken off on a cold December morning in 1943 on a mission over Bremen. The flak there was the heaviest in northern Germany, and the Luftwaffe defended the city with everything it had. As Ye Old Pub approached the target, a spray of flak shells tore through the nose and cockpit. The bombardier was wounded. The pilot, Charlie Brown, was bleeding heavily. The oxygen system was destroyed. The entire nose was smashed open, letting freezing air blast through the aircraft. A wave of German fighters attacked next, hitting the tail, the wings, the engines. The fortress was so riddled with holes that Brown could see the ground through the floor. His tail gunner reported he could not fire because the guns were frozen in place. Most pilots would have bailed out, but Brown refused. The crew was wounded, but alive. He forced the bomber to level out, half-conscious, barely breathing, one hand on the control yoke. Then something happened that no one could have predicted. A Bf-109 pulled up beside the crippled fortress. Its pilot, Franz Stiegler, looked through the shattered windows and saw the wounded American crew. Instead of finishing them, he saluted, flew alongside them across the coast, and escorted them out of German airspace before turning back. Ye Old Pub landed safely in England. The ground crew counted more than 150 holes in the fuselage. Hayes remembered staring at the photograph. The entire tail looked like a torn sheet of metal, the bullet holes so close together they seemed like a single wound. Yet the bomber had flown hundreds of miles home. That was the magic of the fortress. Another story came from a veteran engineer, a man with grease forever stained into his hands. He spoke about a B-17 called Red Gremlin. It had flown deep into Norway on a maritime strike, only to be hit by flak that destroyed one engine and crippled another. The fortress lost altitude so rapidly that the crew could see white foam spraying off the tops of the waves below. But the pilot refused to give up. He coaxed every ounce of power from the remaining engines, feathered the damaged propellers, and trimmed the plane to the edge of stall. The bomber limped over the freezing North Sea for hours. Crewmen took turns bailing water that seeped into the fuselage from the shattered belly. Every minute felt like the last.
But the fortress held. It reached the Shetland Islands with fumes left in the tanks and one engine coughing its final breath. The landing was rough, but it was a landing. Hayes asked the engineer how that bomber stayed in the air. The man shook his head. A B-17 does not fly home on engines. It flies home on will. The story that shook Hayes the most, however, came from a young radio operator who spoke with a quiet, trembling voice. His aircraft had been hit so badly that the top turret was torn from its mount. The dome that once protected the gunner was ripped off completely, leaving a gaping wound in the roof of the fuselage. Flying at altitude without pressurization was already brutal, but flying with an open hole in the roof meant wind so cold it felt like knives cutting across their faces. The temperature inside the aircraft plummeted. Frost collected on the gun barrels, on the radio equipment, on the clothes of the crew, but that was not the worst of it. Both pilots were wounded. The co-pilot could not move one arm. The pilot drifted in and out of consciousness. The aircraft was on the verge of spinning out of control. So the flight engineer took over. From the catwalk in the bomb bay, with his hands on the emergency cables, he controlled the bomber manually, pulling the cables like reins, adjusting its climb and descent through brute strength alone. For 2 hours, he guided the fortress back to England, muscles burning, lungs frozen, eyes watering in the freezing wind. When they landed, he collapsed on the runway. The ground crew carried him away while medics rushed the pilots to safety. He lived. So did the aircraft. So did every man on board. Hayes sat in silence after hearing the story, running his hand along the cold metal skin of his own bomber. He understood the fear every crewman felt when stepping into a B-17, but he also understood something deeper. The fortress fought for them, too. It was not just the crews who refused to give up. It was the airplane itself. Every dented rib, every reinforced beam, every redundant cable, every rivet that held metal plates together. It was built to take punishment, built to protect, built to survive. As the days passed, Hayes learned more stories. A B-17 that came home with its chin turret missing entirely. Another with a wing so shredded that mechanics joked they could see tomorrow through it. One that landed with the tail guns melted from firing so long. And through all of these stories, one truth became clear. The Flying Fortress was not just a bomber. It was a shield. A sanctuary of steel that carried young men across the deadliest skies on Earth and brought them home when nothing else should have kept them alive. But the greatest truth of all was yet to come, and Hayes felt it like a whisper in the back of his mind. The fortress was becoming something more than a machine. It was becoming a myth. And in the final act of every mission, when the sun dipped low and the aircraft limped home over the North Sea, smoke trailing, engines dying, the crews whispered the same words again and again.
The winter wind rolled across the English airfield like a cold tide, carrying with it the faint smell of fuel, oil, and burned metal. The sun was beginning to sink behind the distant tree line, painting the horizon in gold and deep red. Shadows stretched across the pierced metal planking of the runway. Mechanics were packing away tools, medics checked supplies, and ground crews waited at the edge of the field for the returning bombers of the 8th Air Force. They had done this hundreds of times. Waited, listened, prayed, and, as always, they scanned the sky with a mixture of fear and hope, searching for the familiar silhouettes that meant another crew had survived the day. Lieutenant Hayes stood with them, his jacket zipped tightly against the cold. His bomber had landed earlier, battered and bruised but intact. Now he waited for the others. The roar of distant engines grew louder, deep and uneven, as if torn apart by the wind. Then the first fortress appeared. At first, it looked like a shadow limping across the sky. As it drew closer, Hayes felt his breath catch. Entire panels of metal were missing from its left wing.
The landing gear hung crooked, one wheel barely attached. Black smoke poured from one of the engines. A jagged hole gaped near the radio compartment, big enough for a man to crawl through. Yet the aircraft stayed steady, steady enough to land, steady enough to come home. The wheels hit the runway. The bomber bounced once, twice, then rolled to a stop. Ground crews ran toward it, shouting orders, climbing onto the wings, pulling open hatches. The pilot staggered out of the cockpit, face pale, uniform soaked in sweat and oil. Hayes stepped forward and asked the question every crewman asked after a landing like that. How did she stay in the air? The pilot shook his head slowly. I do not know. She just would not go down. It was a familiar answer, and it was becoming the answer for nearly every fortress that survived impossible damage. The Flying Fortress was more than the sum of its metal and engines. Its bones were built from overlapping frames of hardened alloy, stronger than almost anything else in the air. Its control systems had backups for the backups, designed so that even if cables snapped or electronics burned out, the pilots could still coax the plane through the sky. Its wings were thick, heavy, and reinforced to survive flak that would shred other aircraft. And its 4 engines meant redundancy beyond imagination. Lose 1, you flew home. Lose 2, you still had a chance. Lose 3, and there were still fortresses that limped back across the sea. But Hayes knew the truth went deeper. The fortress lived because its crews refused to surrender it. He thought of the All-American, flying 90 minutes with half a tail. He thought of Ye Olde Pub, escorted home by a German ace who had seen the courage inside it. He thought of Red Gremlin, crawling over the North Sea on 2 dying engines. He thought of the engineer who held the emergency cables like the reins of a wounded horse. He thought of the radio operator who refused to abandon his post even as freezing wind tore through his compartment. These were not normal acts of survival. They were battles of will. Battles fought not against the enemy, but against gravity, fire, and fate itself. More engines were heard overhead. More fortresses approached. Each one told a different story. One had its chin turret missing, torn completely away. Another trailed a long ribbon of smoke from a burning wing. One had a hole in its fuselage so large the ground crew could see straight through the aircraft, from one side to the other. Another had its tail guns melted, the barrels warped from firing too long during a desperate defense. Yet they all came home. The ground crews watched silently as each battered bomber landed. The sun dipped lower. The sky darkened into shades of blue and purple. One by one, the giants returned from enemy territory, dragging their wounds behind them like scars carved into the sky. Hayes felt something shift inside him as he watched the final fortress of the day approach. It flew low, wobbling slightly. The number 3 engine was dead, its propeller frozen in place. The number 1 engine was coughing black smoke. Holes peppered the wings and fuselage. The entire tail section trembled with each gust of wind. The bomber should have fallen long before reaching the coast, but it had not. The fortress descended toward the runway, dipped dangerously, then leveled out at the last moment. Hayes could hear the landing gear groaning as the pilot forced the aircraft onto the ground. The wheels touched. The bomber skidded. Sparks flew. And then it stopped, just a few feet short of the emergency barrier. Silence followed. Then, a cheer. Dozens of men rushed toward the bomber, helping the crew down. Some were bleeding. Some were limping. All were alive. One of the gunners laughed through tears. She would not die. I swear she just kept going. Hayes looked at the aircraft, at the holes torn through its metal, at the torn rudder, at the bent propeller blades scraping the ground. He could barely speak. Someone beside him whispered the words that every man on the field already felt in their bones. That one is going in the records. But even as they spoke, Hayes understood that records would never fully capture what the Flying Fortress meant to the men who flew it. It was not simply a machine. It was a promise. A lifeline stretched across the killing fields of Europe. A shield made of steel and courage. When the war ended, many of the great fortresses would be scrapped, melted down, forgotten by industry and government alike. But not by the crews. Not by the men who owed their lives to its stubborn, impossible strength. They would remember. They would tell their sons, and those sons would tell theirs. Because the B-17 Flying Fortress was not remembered for how it fought. It was remembered for how it survived, and for one truth that echoed across airfields from England to North Africa. It was the plane that refused to die.